Vikings versus England. 865 AD, the Great Heathen War begins, and the sons of Ragnar come for revenge. This is the story of how Ivar Halfdan and Uber dragged England into 14 years of fire, fear, and ruin. The year is 865. The North Sea is a black, heaving road. On it, sails appear like a moving forest, and beneath them a coalition of Scandinavian warbands, far larger than anything the English have ever seen, and not at plunder, but at conquest. They will be called the Great Heathen Army. Somewhere in the midst of that approaching fleet is a legend sharp enough to cut flesh. Ragnar Lodbrok, dead in a pit of snakes, if the sagas are to be believed. His sons swear that England will pay in blood. Yet the English chronicles, cold and practical, never confirm the revenge story. They only record what followed, kingdoms collapsing one by one, and York Northumbria's crown falling to the invaders in 866. But here's the question that hangs over the first winter like a drawn blade. When the Vikings step onto English soil, are they hunting a throne, or something far darker that even they won't name aloud? They came the way winter comes, not announced, not negotiated with, but rolling in over the horizon until the world you knew was gone. In the late summer of 865, the sea between Scandinavia and England was busy with small raids, as it had been for decades. A monastery here, a trading port there, fast violence, quick wealth, then the ships vanished back into fog. England had learned to live with that pain the way a man learns to live with old scars. You flinch, you curse, you rebuild. This was different. On the eastern edge of the island, fishermen watched the water and saw sails that did not thin out. They multiplied. One line became two became 10. The shoreline filled with holes, and the air filled with a sound England had never heard at this scale. Thousands of men landing with purpose, not panic, stacking shields, unloading horses, marking ground as if they meant to stay. The Anglo-Saxons would later call it the Great Heathen Army, a name born of fear, because heathen meant more than pagan. It meant foreign, unstoppable, outside the mercy of Christ and King. The chronicles never tell us their number, only that it was the largest Viking force anyone could remember. Large enough to conquer, not merely to steal. At the head of this storm were three brothers, bound by blood and by a story that may have been half truth, half weapon. Ivar the boneless, the strategist with eyes like winter eyes. Halfdan Ragnarsson, the Har commander, a man who moved armies the way other men move cattle. Feared for ferocity. A warrior whose name in English mouths sounded like a curse. They were said to be the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok, the legendary writer. The sagas say Ragnar died in Northumbria, thrown into a pit of snakes by King Glar. The sagas say the sons swore an oath England would burn until the debt was paid. But the English sources, written by monks who had no love for Viking poetry, do not mention revenge. They don't deny it either. They just record the outcome, as if motive mattered less than the hoofbeats that followed. Revenge or not, the brothers understood something most raiders never did. England was not one nation. It was four kingdoms with four crowns, four jealous courts, and four different ideas of who deserved to rule. Northumbria in the north, divided, and proud Mercia in the middle, rich and exposed. East Anglia in the east, small but strategically vital. Wessex in the south, hard-boned, ambitious, and watching everyone else with suspicion. You don't have to smash a wall if you can walk through the cracks. East Anglia was first because it was nearest, and because it was vulnerable. The Viking landed there not like wolves, but like men who had already mapped the room. King Edmund faced them with a sick truth in his stomach. He could fight and be erased in a week, or bargain and live to fight later. So he chose a third path that felt like peace, but tasted like surrender. He gave them horses. Imagine the humiliation of it. The king of East Anglia handing over the very thing that made an army mobile, praying to buy time. But time is a currency predators spend better than prey. The Vikings took the horses, took the winter, and took the measure of England's fear. They wintered at Setford, not in tents of desperation, but in camps of intention. The fires burned through the dark months, and across those fires plans were laid, not a raid route, a conquest route, and that alone was a revelation to the English. Vikings had always been weather deadly, sudden, and gone. This was an occupation, a season that refused to end when spring softened the ground. The army moved north. Northumbria, the oldest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was already bleeding. Its king, Osbert, had been driven out by a rival Gley. Civil war makes men stupid. With urgency, each faction fears the other more than any outsider. Northumbria's nobles were still sharpening knives for their neighbors when the foreign army reached their gates. The Vikings came to York in November of 866. York was more than a city. It was the spine of the north, once Roman, now Anglo-Saxon, filled with stone walls, markets, churches, and the pride of a kingdom that thought itself too ancient to fall. The brothers did not rush it. A siege is not only about starving bodies, it is about starving hope. They surrounded the city, probed its defenses, cut roads, let winter air and uncertainty do half their work. Inside York, Osbert and Gley faced a choice so bitter it could split a soul, keep fighting each other and lose everything, or unite against the invaders and risk giving your enemy legitimacy. Pride argued. Survival screamed louder. They united. The English kings gathered men from across Northumbria and struck the camp with a force born of desperation. For a moment, it looked like the old world was still strong enough to push back. Swords flashed. Shields buckled. The roar of men who believed God was watching shook the frozen air. Then the Vikings. Trap closed. The sources tell us only that the English attack failed catastrophically, that both kings died, that York was taken and held. But picture why, these were not scattered raiders. This was a coalition used to fighting in tight discipline, men who had learned war in Ireland and Francia, on coasts that had taught them patience and coordination. Archaeology world, they let the Northumbrians surge forward, let them break formation in the heat of the assault, then hit their flanks, drove them into the streets, and turned York itself into a killing maze. When the dust settled, the crown of Northumbria lay in the mud beside the bodies of its kings. That was the first payoff of the Great Heathen War. The oldest kingdom in England cracked open in a single season. If you're feeling the weight of that moment, stay with me, because what happened at York wasn't just a victory. It was a message to every other king on the island. The rules have changed, and the sea has delivered men who do not plan to leave. With York taken, the brothers had a capital, supplies, and a psychological weapon sharper than any axe. The Great Army was no longer a rumor on the coast. It was a fact in the center of England's map. And here the war tilts into something colder, because once a conqueror has a foothold, he must decide what kind of ruler he wants to be. A butcher, who burns everything behind him, or a kingmaker who uses fear like a brochet. The Vikings chose the second. They installed a puppet ruler in Northumbria, a man who would obey them as long as their swords remained nearby. It was a strategy that showed the brothers were not just furious sons chasing a legend. They were politicians in iron. From York, they could strike south into Mercia, east into the rivers, west toward the Irish Sea. They could winter safely and move when the land allowed. Control of a city like York meant control of roads, rivers, and the flow of wealth. It meant the Great Army could become a permanent shadow. In the long nights after York fell, messengers rode hard to every court in England. They carried news that tasted like ash. Northumbria is broken. The heathens hold York. 2 kings are dead. In Mercia, King Burgard listened and felt his own borders shrink in his mind. In Wessex, Theled and his younger brother Alfred heard the same words and understood something deeper. This wasn't a storm passing through. This was a new climate. And still, behind all the strategy, the older story breathed at the edge of the firelight. Ragnar's sons, revenge, the pit of snakes, the vow. If that vow was real, then York was only the beginning of payment. If it was myth, that myth was doing its job anyway, binding thousands of warriors to a cause bigger than loot. Either way, the Great Army had crossed the point of no return. England's kingdoms had survived raids before, they had survived each other. But now, for the first time in living memory, a foreign force was sitting inside the island like a thorn. That could not be pulled out. The next move would decide whether England bent, broke, or learned to become something new. And the brothers were already turning their eyes south, toward a richer prize, a softer underbelly, and a kingdom that had not yet understood what last war standing truly means. York in flames drawn over York did not look like victory. It looked like a city holding its breath. Smoke still clung to the streets where Osbert and Glar had died. Doors hung crooked. The great stone walls were scuffed black where fire had licked them. Ravens moved in slow, arrogant circles above the rooftops, as if they already owned the sky. Inside the gates, the Great Army was no longer a guest of war. It was the landlord. The brothers walked the city like men reading a map that only they could see. Ivar moved quietly, listening more than speaking. Halfdan paced the ramparts, measuring fields and roads. Uber stood in the market square, letting the locals see his face, letting fear settle into bones. One does not conquer a kingdom by staying invisible. You conquer it by being remembered. They did not sack York the way smaller bands had sacked towns before. They held it. That choice was the first wound England couldn't stitch closed. A raid is a fever, it passes. This was a new organ growing inside the island. Outside the city, winter came back in hard flashes, and the army made itself comfortable. They repaired defenses, dug ditches, built longhouses out of scavenged timber. Horses fed in pens that had belonged to Northumbrian nobles. The brothers had bought those horses from East Anglia with the threat of annihilation, then used them to ride over the north like a cold tide. Now the same animals stamped and snorted in York's shadow, proof that surrender never ends where it begins. Northumbria, leaderless, tried to breathe around the iron in its chest. Some nobles knelt quickly, preferring survival to pride. Others fled to the hills and fens, promising resistance in whispers. The brothers let them run. A man who runs today can be hunted tomorrow. A man who kneels today can be taxed for years. That was what startled the English, who watched from a distance. The heathens weren't behaving like animals. They were behaving like rulers. By early 867, a messenger rode into York under a white cloth, trembling so badly he could hardly sit straight. He came from Mercia. King Burgred was no fool. He had seen what happened when Northumbria tried to stand alone. He had also seen what happened when it fought itself. He understood that if the Vikings moved south next, the Middle Kingdom would be the anvil on which England broke. So he sent a question wrapped in courtesy, the way desperate men do. What do you want? The answer came back without ink. The great army began to move. They left York in the late summer heat, columns of men and horses stretching like a living road. The locals watched from tree lines and church towers, and something inside them cracked again. The invaders were not retreating to sea. They were marching deeper in, as if the land itself had become their home. Mercia was the belly of England, wide and fertile, and Burgred's heart raced as he tried to prepare it for a knife. He summoned every thane, every fireman, every boy old enough to hold a spear. He sent pleas to Wessex, because Wessex was the only kingdom with enough muscle and discipline to make a stand. In the south, the brothers of Wessex argued in low voices. Tellard was king, but Alfred was the mind that saw farther down the road. Both understood that helping Mercia wasn't charity. If Mercia fell, the heathens would be staring straight at Wessex's throat. So they gathered an army and marched north to meet Burgred. The Christian kings and their men joined forces in Nottingham. The city braced for siege. Its walls were strong, its streets narrow, its stores packed tight. The English believed that if the Vikings wanted in, they would bleed for every step. The great army arrived like a shadow stretching across the fields. They ringed Nottingham and began to test it, not with mindless assaults but with careful pressure. A wall isn't just stone, it's morale. The brothers pressed on that morale the way a thumb presses on a bruise. Inside the city, night after night, English warriors listened to foreign horns calling across the dark. They heard laughter. They heard hammers. They heard the grinding certainty of men who weren't afraid to wait. Weeks passed. Autumn cooled into a damp bite. Food thinned. Tempers cracked. Burgred watched the faces around him turn from confidence to exhaustion. Tellard prayed in public and worried in private. Alfred walked the walls at night, counting the watchers, noticing how often men glanced toward the gates as if imagining flight, and then something odd happened. The Vikings didn't attack. For an army supposedly driven by vengeance and bloodlust, they were strangely patient. The English began to wonder if York had filled them, if winter would weaken them, if perhaps God was finally turning the page. But patience can be a weapon too. One cold morning, Burgred received another messenger from the Viking camp. This one didn't tremble. He looked almost amused. The great army would accept tribute, silver supplies, safe conduct out of Mercia. No battle, no slaughter, just payment. It was the kind of offer that feels like mercy until you taste its poison. Burgred, pinned behind walls and afraid of a catastrophe like York, agreed. The Mercians paid, the West Saxons watched, and the great army folded their tents with the calm of men who had gotten exactly what they came for. To the English, it looked like a reprieve. To the brothers, it was a lesson delivered without a fight. Even united kingdoms could be made to kneel when the Viking columns rolled away from Nottingham. The air inside the city changed. Relief, yes, but also shame, and a quiet terror that was worse than either. If they could buy safety today, what would the price be tomorrow? The answer arrived faster than anyone hoped, because the great army did not go back to York. It turned east, like a knife changing hands, and rode into East Anglia again. King Edmund had thought his bargain bought him a future. Instead, it had bought him the privilege of being conquered last. The Vikings appeared in his lands, with the confidence of men returning to a field they already owned. This time they did not ask for horses. They already had them. They asked for submission, a king's oath, a king's conversion, a king's silence. Edmund refused. In that refusal there was a kind of courage that feels almost naive. He was a young ruler guarding a small kingdom, staring at the same force that had crushed Northumbria and humiliated Mercia, and made Wessex retreat behind diplomacy. He must have known the odds, yet he chose to draw a line anyway. What followed became legend fast. The English sources remember Edmund as a martyr, killed for his faith after refusing to yield. Norse stories remember him as a stubborn king who wouldn't bend. The details blur, but the shape of the moment is sharp. East Anglia fell, and Edmund died. The great army wintered at Thetford once more, not as guests, but as masters. East Anglia became their granary, their stable, their recruiting ground. A kingdom vanished into the Viking war machine, and now, with 2 crowns broken and a third bleeding silver, the brothers looked south again. Wessex, the one kingdom that had not yet been taken. The one kingdom that still believed it could outlast a storm. In the Viking campfires, men spoke of rich monasteries, of towns heavy with trade, of valleys that had never seen a foreign banner planted in their soil. But beneath the talk of wealth there was a harder hunger. If you control Wessex, you control the spine of England. You stop being an invader. You become the future. Alfred heard the news from East Anglia and felt a coldness settle under his ribs. He had seen the great army up close. He knew their patience, their intelligence, their willingness to twist war into something England had never fought before. He also knew Wessex was not ready for another compromise disguised as peace. Across the sea of fields between Thetford and Winchester, the great army began to stir again. Horses were saddled, weapons checked. Men laughed in the way men laugh when they already taste what's coming. In Wessex, church bells rang for prayer, and the Fyrd was called up once more. Thelod put on his crown and his mail. Alfred tightened a sword belt and said very little. There are moments when silence is the only honest thing left. Somewhere between the 2 armies, on a road still wet from winter, the next decision was forming. Wessex would either stand and become a legend, or fall and become another conquered name spoken over foreign fires. And as the great army rode south, the sons of Ragnar carried with them a secret no English king could yet see, because the true target of their next strike wasn't the richest city or the weakest wall, but the one place in Wessex that, if taken, would tear the kingdom open from the inside. The march had begun, and the trap was already being laid. Mercia breaks, Wessex trembles. The first Viking banners appeared on Wessex soil like a bad dream you couldn't blink away. Not at the coast where England expected them, but inland, where fields were still innocent of war. The great army had learned the shape of the island the way a hunter learns a forest. They knew where fear traveled fastest. They knew which towns were keys and which were doors. They rode into Wessex in early 870, and the land answered with alarm bells and hurried prayers. Tellard called the Fyrd, and men came from farms, from villages, from thick-wooded estates where they had never held a shield except for drill. Alfred watched them gather and tried not to let his face reveal what his mind was already weighing. These were brave men. They were not enough. The great army split itself as it moved, a trick that made the English feel surrounded even when they were outnumbering a single column. One force struck at Reading, a royal town on the Thames, and took it brutally fast, throwing up earthworks as if they had always lived there. The other forces fanned into the countryside, stripping food, scouting roads, turning Wessex's own land into a weapon against it. Reading became a thorn in Alfred's side. Every road that mattered bent toward it. Every rumor seemed to echo from it. As long as the Vikings held that place, Wessex was fighting with a knife already in its ribs. Thelard and Alfred marched to meet them, and the first collision came at The English struck hard, surprising a raiding party and killing a Viking alderman. It was a small victory, but for a moment it tasted like oxygen. Men told each other this was a sign. God had not abandoned Wessex. The heathens could bleed. The Vikings answered the way a storm answers a candle. Days later, at Reading, they met the West Saxon army in open battle and broke it. The English line buckled in the wet ground, men slipping on churned mud and blood. Tellard and Alfred fought their way out with what they could save, but they left bodies behind in piles that winter birds would remember. The great army did not cheer. They simply returned to their fortifications. as if the fight had been a formality. The rhythm of the war became brutal and fast. For days after Reading, Wessex met them again at Ashdown, on a high slope where the cold wind made men squint and curse. The Vikings were already formed when the English arrived. To shield walls, 2 worlds, Tellard was late to the field, held back by prayer, or by nerves, or by some burden only kings carry. Alfred stood with half the army, watching the Viking lines settle like a closing door. The brother who was not king felt the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Anyway, he chose to attack. Alfred led his men up the hill before their momentum could rot into fear. The climb was steep and bitter. Shields thudded, spears bit, the air shrank into the sound of men grunting through helmets, into the sting of iron on wood, into the moment when a single step forward feels like moving a mountain. For a while nobody could see how it would end. The shield walls swayed, pushing, grinding, each side trying to unmake the other by sheer will. Then the Vikings began to give ground, not much. A foot, then another. Then the line cracked. When Tellard finally arrived, the battle was already turning. Together, the brothers drove the Vikings down the slope. The English chased them through the winter light, killing many. Ashdown was Wessex's finest moment in the war, the day the last kingdom proved it could still stand toe-to-toe with the invader. But even as men celebrated, Alfred felt the old coldness return. He knew victories like this didn't end wars. They only changed their shape. The Vikings were not frightened away. They regrouped, and they struck back at Basing. Another battle, another English loss, then another at Mercia, where the fighting raged so deep into chaos that even survivors struggled later to tell what they had seen. Wessex was winning and losing in the same breath. Every battle was a cliff edge. Every Don asked the same question again. How long can you keep doing this? In those months, England's old story of Viking raids died completely. This was a war of endurance. The great army had supplies from East Anglia and York. They could move, fall back, return, winter in safety. Wessex had only itself, and the unsteady loyalty of men who needed to return home to plant crops if the kingdom wanted to eat next year. Winter tightened. So did the war. Early in 871, Tellard fell ill. Some said wounds, some said exhaustion, some said the weight of too many funerals. Whatever it was, the king who had fought a dozen battles against the great army was dying while his enemy still sat on his soil. Alfred watched his brother's strength drain away and understood a cruel truth. Wessex could not afford a weak heartbeat at the center. The kingdom needed a leader who could think beyond the next fight. Tellard died in April. The crown passed to Alfred, not as triumph, but as a burden handed over in silence. A new king, a battered army, and the great Heathen Army still there, still hungry somewhere in the Viking camp. Leaders were changing too. Ivar the Boneless, the most feared mind among the brothers, faded from the English stage around this time. Whether he died, turned his gaze elsewhere, or simply became a name carried in rumor, the English chronicles no longer place him at the center. The war did not soften. If anything, it grew more unpredictable. Leadership passed among men with different tempers, different instincts. Halfdan's hand was steadier now. Uber's shadow longer. Alfred tried to buy time. He did what Burgard had done, what Edmund had refused to do. He offered tribute. Silver moved from Wessex into Viking hands. The great army accepted it and moved out, not because they were satisfied, but because they were not ready to finish the job yet. They turned north and then east again, their path twisting like a serpent. Some marched toward Mercia, some stayed in East Anglia, some sailed to new fronts. To the weary people of Wessex, it felt like a miracle. The heathens have left, they said. God has spared us. Alfred knew better. The heathens had not left. They had repositioned. He used a quiet like a man using borrowed breath. He rebuilt fortifications. He reorganized the Fyrd so that not all men had to fight at once. He sent messengers to nobles who had been slow to answer the call, looking them in the eye with a king's patience and a soldier's warning. He learned the land as the Vikings had learned it, imagining how an enemy would move through valleys, where a river could become a shield, where a road could become a trap. While Alfred worked, Mercia bled. Burgred had paid Nottingham to survive. Now Mercia survived only by shrinking. Viking bands pressed deeper into its heartland, and the kingdom that had once called itself the center of England began to look like a prize already written in someone else's book. Burgard fled overseas, broken. In his place, the Vikings raised a new Mercian ruler, a king in name and leash in fact. England was now divided into what the Vikings controlled, and what they were still deciding how to control. Alfred watched those changes from the south, and something in him hardened. If Mercia could become a puppet, Wessex could become one too. The tribute had not bought peace. It had bought a pause between heartbeats, and pauses don't last. In 878, when Wessex had begun to believe the worst was behind it, the great army returned in a way that felt almost personal, not onto the coast in full display, but into the winter night. Slipping toward Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham. There were no warning bells this time, no long column of sails, just the sudden taste of smoke, the jolt of shouting in the dark, the realization that the enemy was already inside the room. Alfred woke to chaos and the sound of his kingdom cracking again. Men ran barefoot through frost. Horses screamed in the yards. Torches flared against walls that hadn't expected war. The Vikings had done it. They had found the place that could tear Wessex open from the inside, and as Alfred rushed into the biting night with only a handful of loyal men around him, the question that had haunted the war since 865 came back sharper than ever. Was this finally the end of Wessex, or the beginning of a different kind of fight that no one in England had imagined yet? Alfred's War of Shadows. The night Chippenham fell, Wessex didn't just lose a town, it lost the illusion that walls and treaties could keep danger outside. Alfred ran through the freezing dark with a handful of men who hadn't been cut down in their sleep. Behind him, his hall burned. Ahead of him, the countryside was already filling with enemies' bands, moving fast, lighting farms to blind the roads, taking hostages to break the will of anyone thinking of resistance. The great army had not returned like a war host. It had returned like thieves who knew your house better than you did. By morning, Alfred was nowhere a king was supposed to be. He was a fugitive in his own land. The stories tell us he fled into the marshes of Somerset, a flat, wet world where reeds swallowed sound and the ground could betray you with every step. It was ugly country, the kind of place nobles avoided and armies hated. That was why it saved him. He vanished into Othenay, an island of mud and timber, and there he built a refuge as small as his situation was massive. If the Vikings believed they had finished Wessex, they had reason. After Chippenham, most of the kingdom submitted. Some nobles knelt because they were terrified. Some because they were tired, others because they judged the war already decided. In the halls where Alfred had once been received as king, foreign commanders now sat with their boots on Christian floors, accepting oaths from men who couldn't meet their eyes. A Danish leader whose name carried weight in that winter took the upper country for himself. He established power centers, collected tribute, and began to act less like a raider and more like a man laying foundations. The great heathen war had at last brought them their oldest dream, not loot, but land. In the marshes Alfred heard all of it through broken messengers and frightened farmers. Every report was a nail. Every day he stayed hidden, felt like another kingdom slipping away. Yet hiding taught him something he could not have learned on a throne. Othenay was poor, but it was invisible. It sat like a secret between rivers. From there Alfred could see the roads the Vikings relied on, the edges of their patrols, the way their confidence made them careless. War changes when you become the smaller force. You stop thinking like a hammer, you start thinking like a knife dot. So Alfred used the marsh the way the Vikings used the sea. He struck suddenly, then disappeared. Small raids, ambushes on supply lines, night attacks that left a few bodies and a lot of doubt. Nothing glorious enough for a saga, but enough to make men whisper that Wessex wasn't dead yet. If you were a West Saxon farmer in those months, you lived between two fears. The fear of Danish riders appearing on the ridge, and a quieter fear that your own king might never return. Some nights you prayed for Alfred's survival. Other nights you prayed for a quick end, because survival had started to feel like dying slowly. Spring crept in, reluctant and grey. Alfred sent word through secret channels, old allies, priests, men whose loyalty had survived humiliation. His message was not a call to romance. It was a call to duty. Meet me in the woods at Egberth's stone. Bring what you can carry. If Wessex is to live, it lives now. This was a gamble built out of desperation. If no one came, Alfred would be a king without a people. If too many came too openly, Vikings would crush them on the march. He waited anyway, and then they came, not in shining columns, in scattered groups, men arriving with mud on their cloaks and worry in their eyes. Thanes who had pretended submission and now slipped away. Farmers with axes they'd used on winter firewood. Young warriors who had never seen battle but could not bear the thought of foreign rule. By the time the mustering ended, Alfred looked out on the most precious sight a defeated king can ever see, an army that still believes in him. It wasn't huge. It didn't need to be. It only needed to be enough to start the wheel turning the other way. The march out of Somerset was tense, quiet, and fast. Alfred moved like a man who knew every moment was borrowed. Scouts fanned ahead. The army kept to cover. avoiding major roads. Each night, fires were hidden. Each morning, prayers were short. No one sang. They were not going to war for glory. They were going because the alternative was to wake up one day and realize their grandchildren would speak another language. Guthrum heard the news late. His advantage had always been speed and surprise. Now, surprise had changed sides. He gathered his men and moved west toward Edington. The field there was open enough for a large battle, but close enough to Danish positions that he believed he could crush Alfred quickly before more West Saxons rallied. He still saw Alfred as a cornered animal. Alfred walked into Edington knowing he was walking into the moment that would end the war one way or another. His men formed their shield wall, a line of oak and iron, faces tight, breath white in the morning air. Across from them, the Danish wall rose like a tide of steel. The world between the two lines narrowed into a strip of grass. No, wider than a heartbeat. The first clash sounded like the island breaking. Shields slammed, spears thrust. Men pushed shoulder to shoulder, heel to toe, fighting not as individuals, but as a single organism grinding against another. The noise was a blur of splintering wood, metal shock, and raw human breath. Alfred stood where a king had to stand, close enough to feel the shove of the line, far enough to be seen. The men on either side of him watched his posture the way sailors watch the horizon. If he bent, they bent. If he held, they held. The fight went on and on. Minutes that felt like hours. The Danish line surged, then stalled. The West Saxons buckled, then stiffened. Bloody hands reached for fallen spears. Men fought over inches of earth because inches were the difference between standing and being trampled. Somewhere in that grind, something shifted. Not a miracle, not a sudden collapse, just the slow, terrible math of endurance. Alfred's wall held. It held long enough for Danish arms to tire, long enough for Danish confidence to thin, long enough for the West Saxons to feel the first dangerous spark of hope they'd pushed. The Danish line began to slide backward, a step another, a break that wasn't a break yet. Guthrum tried to rally it, but you cannot yell strength back into legs that have already spent it. The great army so long the predator was being driven like prey. When the Danish wall finally cracked, it didn't explode. It folded inward, retreating toward their fortifications, toward the safety of a camp that had never felt so far away. Alfred pressed them hard, not giving them space to breathe, chasing them into their stronghold. By evening, Guthrum and his men were locked behind their defenses, with Alfred outside, ringed tight. The roles had reversed cleanly. For weeks the Danes were trapped, their food dwindling, their morale eating itself. They had been invincible storms for 14 years. Now they were men staring at hunger. Guthrum asked for terms. Alfred offered them terms sharper than any sword. Guthrum would leave Wessex. He would accept baptism. He would bind himself with oaths that would be read aloud so every man could hear the shape of the new world. To the West Saxons, it felt like deliverance. To the Danes, it was survival wrapped in humiliation. But Guthrum agreed. He had no other road left. The baptism took place at Olarn near Uthoni, the same marshland that had hidden Alfred like a seed. Alfred stood as Guthrum's sponsor, and the Danish warlord took the Christian name Athelstan for England. It was a scene almost too strange to believe. The man who had tried to erase Wessex now kneeling in its faith, while the king who had fled through mud now watched him with a steady, measuring gaze. Yet even in victory, Alfred's mind did not rest, because a baptism can change a man's name, but it doesn't change a hunger that has shaped an army for a generation. The great army had been checked, not destroyed. It still held East Anglia. It still held York. It still held Mercia in its grip. The war had changed its costume, not its nature. As Guthrum's men prepared to withdraw and Alfred's people began to breathe again, the king looked beyond the immediate relief and saw the long shadow ahead. Wessex had survived, but England was now something else, split, scarred, and standing at a border that hadn't existed before. That border was about to be drawn in ink that could decide the fate of the island for centuries. Alfred knew it. Guthrum knew it. Neither man spoke it aloud yet, because the next fight wouldn't be for a battlefield, it would be for the map. The land divided. Peace sounds gentle when you say the word. On the ground, it sounded like men arguing over a riverbank with swords still warm in their hands. After Edington, the great army pulled back as promised. Danish columns moved eastward, away from Wessex's heart, away from Alfred's reach. They did it in good order, not like a defeated rabble, but like a force choosing its next position. Villagers watched them go with the stunned quiet of people who had survived a fire and were afraid to breathe in case embers were still hiding in the thatch. Alfred let them leave. That choice was harder than any battle. because a fresh victory pulls at a warrior's soul like a tidal current. His men wanted to chase, to finish what the war had started, to wipe the heathens from the island. Alfred had felt the same desire at Ashdown, at every funeral since reading. But a king learns to read time differently. He understood that to chase the Danes into their own territory now would be to drag Wessex back into exhaustion, and that exhaustion was exactly what had almost killed it. So he stopped at the border of his strength and watched the enemy retreat into lands they already held. The treaty that followed was not a feast of reconciliation. It was a line carved into England with the point of necessity. Alfred and Guthrum met, and the terms were shaped not only by words but by geography. Wessex would remain Alfred's. The Danes would keep East Anglia and much of the north and east. Mercia, already gutted, would be split along the old Roman road called Watling Street. If you stood on a rise and looked across the island after that agreement, you would not see a unified England. You would see a land cut in two kinds of law, two kinds of speech, two kinds of future. The English called the Danish-held region the Dane. To the West Saxons, the new border was a scar. To the Danes it was a foundation. In the towns they kept, they planted their own courts, their own measurements, their own habit of settling disputes by oath and fine rather than by the king's whim. They minted coins. They dug deeper farms. They married into local families. The invaders had become neighbors, and that, more than any battle, was the strange victory of the Great Heathen War, because the sons of Ragnar, whether driven by vengeance, ambition, or simply the unstoppable momentum of opportunity, had done what earlier Viking raiders never truly aimed to do. They had made themselves part of the island's bones. In York, Halfdan ruled with the quiet competence of a man who had learned that a crown was lighter than a helmet. He divided land among his followers. He encouraged new settlements. Northumbria, once the proud elder kingdom, was now a Danish kingdom in all but name. In East Anglia, Guthrum, now baptized, now calling himself Aethelstan, sat on a throne that still smelled faintly of war. His baptism was real, at least in ceremony, but the deeper conversion was political. He had lost the chance to take Wessex, so he chose to secure what he still held. For a while, the island steadied, roads reopened, markets whispered back to life. People who had spent years listening for hoofbeats at night began to sleep with both eyes closed again. But peace, even fragile peace, gives men time to remember everything they lost. In Wessex, Alfred moved like a man who knew that treaties are not endings. They are pauses where you decide who you will be when the war returns. He rebuilt the kingdom with a patience that felt almost unnatural in a generation raised on quick battles. Earthworks rose into new fortified townsburghs, placed like shields across river crossings and roads. He reorganized the Fyrd so half the army could farm while the other half trained, ensuring Wessex would never again collapse simply because its men had to harvest grain. He sent scholars across the sea to find books. He learned Latin to read the world that had once belonged to Rome, because he suspected England would need more than axes to survive what was coming. A kingdom doesn't outlast invaders by being stubborn alone. It outlasts them by evolving faster than they do. So while Danish settlers ploughed fields in East Anglia and raised halls in Northumbria, Alfred raised a different kind of weapon in the South Order: learning, fortification, a sense of English identity that Wessex had never needed before because it had never faced an enemy that demanded it. Yet even Alfred could not control the tide everywhere. In Mercia, the western half leaned toward Wessex, clinging to Alfred's protection. The eastern half fell deeper into Danish influence, its towns growing into hybrid places where English and Norse words shared the same streets. Families split along the line. A man might pray in church on Sunday, then drink in a hall on Monday where a Danish lord sat in the high seat. The island was learning to live with two hearts in one body, and in that unsettled world, old questions didn't vanish. They changed shape. What had begun in 865 as an invasion framed by revenge now ended with something more complicated than retribution. If Ragnar's sons had truly come to punish Glar for a snake pit, the payment had long since been made in York's blood. Yet the war had continued far beyond any father's grave. It had become a machine that fed on conquest itself. Maybe that was the answer all along. Revenge was the spark. Land was the fire. Still, there was one more echo of Ragnar's line that the English never forgot. Eubor, the fierce brother whose name came with dread, had died not in Wessex but in Devon, at a battle called Sitnuit, where West Saxon and local forces smashed a Danish detachment and took its raven banner. It was a reminder that even the great invaders were mortal, and that England had learned to bite back in places nobody expected. Halfdan would later fall in Ireland, fighting other Norsemen, in a world where Viking ambition now collided with itself. Ivar had already slipped into the fog of history earlier. his fate uncertain, his legend stronger than his bones. The sons of Ragnar did not end as conquerors of all England. They ended as the men who changed England so deeply that it could never again pretend to be a set of separate kingdoms. That is the quiet irony of their war. By trying to take the island, they forced one part of it to become something new. By the late 880s, travelers walking the border of the Dunor would have sensed it. The air in Wessex felt tighter, more organized, like a kingdom holding itself together with habit and law. The air in Danish lands felt looser, more entrepreneurial, with new towns rising and old ones reshaped. Neither side looked like it had in 865. War had forged them both, and Alfred, older now, carried the look of a man who had stared into ruin and survived by refusing to be the version of himself that ruin expected. He knew that Danelaw was not a final settlement, it was a balance of exhaustion. He knew Danish kings would come after good. He knew new fleets would one day test the Burs the Third, the fragile identity he was building. He also knew something else, something colder and more hopeful at the same time. England was no longer a prize waiting to be taken. It was becoming a thing that could fight for its own existence. When Alfred walked the ramparts of his rebuilt towns, he wasn't only looking at roads and rivers. He was looking at the future. The battlefields behind him had given him a map in his mind, a map of what England might be if it ever stood as one. Yet the island remained divided. The Danes were still strong. The north still answered to foreign lords. The border still breathed like a wound. So the story doesn't end in a clean sunrise. It ends in a long, still moment. A West Saxon king watching the line he has drawn across England, knowing that lines like this are never permanent. Somewhere beyond that border, Danish children are growing up speaking half English, half Norse, and believing just as fiercely that this land is theirs. Somewhere in the north, new war leaders are sharpening ambitions that will not care about Guthrum's baptism or Alfred's treaties. The great heathen war is over. The north is quiet, the south is rebuilding, and across the island, under the fragile hush of peace, two futures are standing face to face, waiting for the next tide to decide which one will finally own the name England.